June 1943, somewhere over the Tunisian coast, a 21-year-old Navy gunner named Robert Chen stands behind a Browning .50 caliber mounted on the stern of USS Savannah. The morning sun turns the Mediterranean into hammered bronze, and through the glare he spots them. 7 Junkers Ju-87 Stukas, their inverted gull wings unmistakable even at 4,000 yards, beginning their approach run toward the cruiser task force. Chen does exactly what 6 months of training have drilled into his nervous system. He tracks the lead aircraft as it climbs to bombing altitude, puts his ring sight directly on the distinctive fixed landing gear, and waits for it to enter effective range. The Stuka rolls into its dive at 8,000 feet, nose dropping past vertical, and Chen squeezes the trigger. 50 caliber rounds scream out at 2,900 feet per second. Tracer fire arcs upward in what looks like a perfect intercept course. Every single bullet passes harmlessly in front of the diving aircraft. Chen's not alone in his failure. Across the task force, 16 other ships open fire simultaneously. The sky fills with tracer rounds, puffs of 40mm explosions, even 5-inch proximity-fused shells detonating in clouds of shrapnel. The Stukas continue their dives untouched, release their bombs at 1,500 feet, and pull out so low their propellers throw spray from the wave tops. USS Birmingham takes a near miss that floods 2 compartments. USS Philadelphia's forward gun mount is knocked offline by bomb splinters. Not a single Stuka goes down. This wasn't an isolated incident. This same deadly pattern had been playing out across the Mediterranean theatre since Operation Torch began in November 1942. American gunners, well-trained, equipped with the finest anti-aircraft weapons ever manufactured, supported by the most advanced fire control technology available, were missing diving Stukas at rates that made pre-war. Planners physically sick when they saw the combat data. The Navy's Bureau of Ordnance conducted an extensive study in April 1943, analysing after-action reports from 78 separate Stuka attacks against Allied naval vessels operating between Casablanca and Tunis. The statistics were catastrophic. Against dive-bombing attacks, shipboard anti-aircraft batteries were achieving hit rates below 2%. 2%. That meant for every 100 rounds fired at a Stuka in its attack dive, 98 shells were exploding harmlessly while the aircraft continued toward bomb release. The mathematics were brutal and unforgiving. A typical Stuka attack gave defending gunners approximately 18 to 22 seconds of engagement time from the moment the aircraft committed to its dive until bomb release. A Bofors 40mm gun, the backbone of American naval anti-aircraft defense, fired roughly 120 rounds per minute. That's 2 rounds per second. In a 20-second engagement, a single mount could theoretically put 40 rounds into the air. With a 2% hit rate, that meant fewer than 1 shell would actually connect with the target. 1 hit wasn't enough to stop a Stuka. German combat reports indicated that Ju-87 seconds routinely absorbed 5 to 8 hits from 20mm or 40mm fire and continued flying. The airframe was rugged, built to withstand the violent stresses of near-vertical dives and high-G pullouts. Light damage didn't ground them, didn't even necessarily abort their attacks. You needed multiple solid hits, preferably to the engine or cockpit, to actually down one of these aircraft. The human and material cost was staggering. Between November 1942 and May 1943, Stuka attacks in the Mediterranean sank 11 Allied vessels and damaged 63 others seriously enough to require dockyard repairs. Those damaged ships meant reduced fleet capability at critical moments. That damaged cruiser couldn't provide naval gunfire support during the Anzio landings. That crippled destroyer couldn't screen the carrier group, and every ship in dock was a ship that wasn't putting ordnance on enemy positions. The casualties mounted with each attack. A near miss that ruptured fuel lines could kill men just as dead as a direct hit. Bomb splinters tore through exposed crew positions. Secondary explosions from damaged ammunition storage sent metal fragments ricocheting through passageways. The medical logs from USS Savannah after that June attack recorded 16 wounded, 3 dead, from an engagement where not a single bomb actually struck the ship. Everything was near misses and fragmentation, and the gunners hadn't scratched a single attacking aircraft. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The gunners were doing everything right according to their training doctrine. Tracking the target smoothly, maintaining proper sight picture, controlling their bursts to conserve ammunition, adjusting their aim as the aircraft descended. The problem wasn't their courage, their commitment, or even their basic competence with their weapons. The problem was physics, specifically physics that human intuition couldn't process correctly under combat stress. And physics didn't care about determination or bravery or how many hours you'd spent on the practice range. Every gunner instinctively aimed at what they could see. It made perfect, logical sense. The threat was visible, right there in your gun sight. A German aircraft diving toward your ship, carrying a bomb meant to kill you and everyone you served with. You pointed at that aircraft. You pulled the trigger. The shell should hit it. That's how shooting worked. That's how it had always worked since the invention of projectile weapons. But Stukas weren't stationary. Targets. They weren't even targets moving horizontally across your field of view like the fighters gunners had trained against. Stukas were diving almost vertically at speeds that increased every second, as gravity added velocity to their forward momentum. A Ju-87 beginning its attack dive at 8,000 feet would start around 200 miles per hour. By the time it reached 3,000 feet, it was doing 350 miles per hour, maybe faster if the pilot pushed it. At those velocities, combined with the near-vertical angle of attack, the time delay between when you fired and when your projectile reached the target's altitude created a massive displacement. Your eyes saw the aircraft at one position. Your brain processed that information and sent firing commands to your hands. Your hands squeezed the trigger. The shell left the barrel, travelled upward through the air, and arrived at the altitude where the Stuka had been approximately 1/3 of a second ago. In that third of a second, at 350 miles per hour, the Stuka had moved forward and downward roughly 170 feet. Your shell exploded behind and above the aircraft, passing through empty air that the Stuka had occupied a moment earlier but had already left behind. And because the aircraft was diving, getting lower and faster every instant, that displacement increased the longer the engagement continued. This phenomenon had a precise technical name that most gunners had never heard. It was called pursuit curve error, and it represented the fundamental challenge of shooting at any target, moving directly toward or away from your position. The deflection wasn't side to side, it was forward to backward along the line of flight, and human brains were catastrophically bad at calculating it intuitively. Against crossing targets, moving perpendicular to your line of sight, gunners had been taught deflection shooting. Lead the target, aim ahead of where it is. Now, the Mark 14 lead computing sight, introduced in 1943, did this automatically for horizontal crossing shots, using gyroscopes and mechanical calculators to show gunners exactly where to aim. The technology worked beautifully against conventional attacks and had multiplied hit rates against level bombers and strafing fighters by factors of 5 or 6. But the Mark 14 and the doctrine behind it assumed horizontal movement. The computer solved for lateral deflection, for targets crossing your field of view at 90 degrees or some lesser angle. When the designers built the system, they'd been thinking about Japanese torpedo bombers coming in low across the water, about German fighters making beam attacks on bomber formations. Nobody had specifically optimized the system for near-vertical dives, because American planners hadn't expected to face that threat at sea. The Stuka was supposed to be obsolete by 1943. Intelligence estimates said so. Aviation experts said so. The Ju-87 was slow, vulnerable to fighters, lacked the speed and maneuverability to survive in contested airspace against modern interceptors. And those assessments were correct. Stukas were being massacred when they encountered Allied fighters. But in the Mediterranean theatre, during the first half of 1943, Allied fighters couldn't be everywhere at once. When Stukas found naval task forces without air cover, When they caught convoys during that vulnerable window between cap rotations, they were still devastatingly effective. Because while the aircraft might be obsolete in air-to-air combat, the tactic of near-vertical dive bombing remained one of the most accurate ways to deliver ordnance onto a moving ship. And American gunners, despite their advanced technology, despite their training, despite their courage, couldn't hit them. The psychological toll was almost as destructive as the physical damage. Gun crews would man their stations during general quarters, knowing from experience that when the Stukas came, they would fire hundreds of rounds, watch their tracers arc into the sky, see the aircraft continue unscathed, and then brace for the bombs. The feeling of helplessness was corrosive. You had a weapon, you had a clear target, you knew your job, and none of it mattered because some quirk of geometry and velocity made your bullets arrive in the wrong piece of sky. After action debriefings in Algiers and Tunis became exercises in shared frustration. Gunners reported the same experience across dozens of separate engagements. They'd been shooting. Their weapons had been functioning perfectly. Their aim had been true, centered on the target throughout the dive. But their shells consistently exploded behind the aircraft, sometimes by what looked like 50 feet or more. A few crew chiefs thought maybe the proximity fuses were malfunctioning, detonating too late. Tests proved the fuses were working exactly as designed. The problem wasn't the weapons. The problem wasn't the ammunition. The problem was that every instinct, every training drill, every piece of conventional wisdom about marksmanship was leading gunners to aim at exactly the wrong point in space. And until someone figured out how to fix that fundamental disconnect between intuition and physics, American ships would keep getting bombed by aircraft they should have been able to destroy. Something had to change, and it had to change immediately, because the invasion of Sicily was scheduled for early July 1943. That meant hundreds of Allied ships gathered in confined waters, providing enormous targets for every Stuka unit the Luftwaffe could scrape together in the Mediterranean. At current hit rates, at current defensive effectiveness, those invasion fleets were going to take casualties that might compromise the entire operation. The answer, when it finally emerged, wouldn't come from the expected sources. Not from weapons designers or fire control engineers or the Navy's Bureau of Ordnance. It would come from an observation so counterintuitive, so apparently wrong, that the first officers who heard it thought it was either a joke or evidence of combat fatigue. The solution to shooting down diving aircraft was to aim behind them, not ahead, where every deflection shooting principle said you should lead a moving target. Behind, trailing the visible aircraft with your gun sight, firing at where it used to be instead of where it was going. It sounded insane. It violated everything anyone knew about gunnery, and it was about to kill more Stukas in 1 month than all previous defensive tactics combined. The discovery happened almost by accident, born from the kind of desperation that makes people examine their fundamental assumptions, because continuing with conventional approaches meant continuing to die. Lieutenant Commander Marcus Webb wasn't supposed to be a tactical innovator. He was a gunnery officer aboard USS Philadelphia, a Brooklyn-class light cruiser that had been taking Stuka attacks since Operation Torch began. Webb had a degree in mechanical engineering from Purdue, and he'd spent most of 1942 helping troubleshoot fire control systems as the Navy rapidly expanded its fleet. He was technical, methodical, the kind of officer who kept detailed logs of everything, because understanding systems meant understanding how to fix them when they broke. After the June attack, where Philadelphia's forward mount was damaged, Webb started doing something unusual. He requisitioned the optical tracking camera footage from every Stuka engagement his ship had experienced. These cameras, mounted alongside the main battery directors, recorded what the fire control team was seeing and tracking during action. They weren't gun cameras showing where rounds were going. They were tracking cameras showing where the systems thought the target was. Webb spent 3 days in a darkened compartment running the footage frame by frame, measuring angles with a protractor held against the projection screen, timing sequences with a stopwatch. He was looking for any pattern that might explain why shells consistently exploded behind diving Stukas. Maybe there was a systematic error in the fire control computer. Maybe the Mark 14's gyroscopes couldn't handle vertical target movement correctly. Maybe something about the dive angle was throwing off the ballistic calculations. What he found was simpler and more disturbing. The fire control system was working perfectly. The shells were going exactly where they were aimed. The problem was that the system was aiming at the aircraft's current position, and by the time shells reached that altitude, the aircraft had already descended past it. Webb did the mathematics longhand on a legal pad, using basic physics equations he remembered from college. A 40mm shell left the barrel at approximately 2,800 feet per second. Against a target at 5,000 feet altitude, the shell needed roughly 1.8 seconds to reach that height, accounting for gravitational deceleration and air resistance. A Stuka diving at 300 miles per hour covered 440 feet per second. In 1.8 seconds, that aircraft descended 792 feet and moved forward another 600 feet or so, depending on dive angle. The displacement was enormous. Your shell arrived at empty sky not because of any mechanical failure, but because of pure physics. Time of flight plus target velocity equals miss distance. The equation was unforgiving and immutable. You couldn't change the speed of your projectile without redesigning the gun and ammunition. You couldn't reduce time of flight without changing the laws of ballistics. The only variable you could modify was where you aimed. Webb's conclusion, written in a memo to his captain dated June 22nd, 1943, was stark. Current doctrine assumes we should lead the target, aiming ahead of its flight path to compensate for movement during shell travel time. This is correct for horizontal crossing targets. It is catastrophically wrong for near-vertical diving targets, where the movement is primarily toward our position rather than across our field of view. We are leading when we should be trailing. His recommendation sounded like lunacy. Gunners should aim behind diving aircraft, specifically targeting a point along the projected dive path that accounts for how far the aircraft will have descended during shell time of flight. In practical terms, when a Stuka is at 4,000 feet in its dive, aim at approximately 5,000 feet, where it was roughly 1.5 seconds ago. Fire at altitude it's already passed. Let the aircraft dive down into the shell burst, rather than trying to predict where it will be. Webb's captain, Harry Sanders, read the memo twice, called Webb to his sea cabin, and asked him to explain it again because it seemed impossible. "You're telling me," Sanders said, "that we need to aim at empty sky behind the target and hope the target flies backward into our shells." Webb's response became part of Philadelphia's unofficial history. "Not backward, sir, downward. We're not leading it horizontally. We're creating a barrage zone along its dive path at a higher altitude. The aircraft descends into the kill zone because it can't stop diving once it's committed." Sanders was skeptical but desperate enough to authorize testing. On June 25th, during exercises off Bizerte, Philadelphia's after 40mm mounts were configured with Webb's proposed solution, manually programmed into their fire control computers. The crew used captured training footage of Stuka dives to calculate the proper aim point. When a Stuka was at 4,000 feet, they'd aim at 5,200 feet. When it dropped to 3,000, they'd aim at 4,000, always above the aircraft by an amount calculated to match time of flight. The results weren't immediately conclusive because they were shooting at drones, not actual attack profiles. But the hit percentages climbed noticeably. More importantly, the pattern of near misses changed. Instead of shells bursting consistently behind and below the target, they were now bursting ahead and above, exactly where they needed to be to intercept a descending aircraft. Word of Webb's theory spread through unofficial channels, the way tactical innovations always spread in wartime. Gunnery officers talked to each other during refueling operations, during mail transfer alongside tenders, in the wardrooms of flagships during operational briefings. By early July, as the invasion fleet for Operation Husky assembled at Malta and Algiers, at least a dozen ships had quietly modified their engagement doctrine for dive bombing attacks. They didn't have official authorization. The Bureau of Ordnance hadn't issued new technical manuals. Fleet Training Command hadn't updated their curriculum. but captains and gunnery officers who'd watched too many Stukas escape untouched were willing to try anything, even something as counterintuitive as deliberately aiming behind the target. The Luftwaffe's response to the Sicily invasion would provide the test case under actual combat conditions, and the results would be so dramatic, so undeniable, that they'd force a complete revision of American anti-aircraft doctrine within 30 days. Operation Husky launched on July 10, 1943, with over 2,800 Allied vessels converging on Sicily's southern and eastern coasts. It was the largest amphibious operation attempted to that point in the war, involving 7 divisions hitting the beaches simultaneously across a 100-mile front. The Luftwaffe knew it was coming. Reconnaissance aircraft had been tracking the fleet build-up for days. Every Stuka unit still operational in the Mediterranean received orders to concentrate against the invasion shipping. Stuka Geschwader 2, based at airfields near Naples, and Stuka Geschwader 3, operating from captured Sicilian fields, represented the primary dive bomber threat. Between them, they could put roughly 90 Ju-87 Stukas into the air on short notice, and they'd been training specifically for anti-shipping strikes since spring. These weren't inexperienced crews. These were veterans who'd survived the campaign in North Africa, who'd been attacking Allied convoys for 6 months, who knew their aircraft's capabilities and limitations intimately. They expected heavy anti-aircraft fire. They expected losses. What they didn't expect was that the fundamental defensive response would have changed in the 2 weeks since their last major attack. The first engagement happened at 0640 hours on July 11th, as the sun rose over the landing beaches at Gela. 9 Stukas, from 2nd Group, 3rd Geschwader, made their approach from the northwest, targeting the destroyer screen protecting the transport area. USS Maddox and USS Shubrick were the closest vessels, both Fletcher-class destroyers with modern anti-aircraft fits, including Mark 14-equipped Bofors mounts. Both ships had gunnery officers who'd heard about Philadelphia's experiments. Both had quietly implemented Webb's trailing aim doctrine. When the Stukas rolled into their dives at 7,000 feet, the destroyer's 40mm batteries didn't track the aircraft themselves. They aimed at points 1,500 feet above the aircraft positions, creating a curtain of exploding shells that the diving Stukas would descend through on their way to bomb release. The engagement lasted 18 seconds from first round fired to the last Stuka pulling out. 7 of the 9 aircraft were hit. 3 went straight into the sea, catastrophic damage that sent them tumbling out of controlled flight. 2 others broke off smoking heavily, jettisoned their bombs early, and limped away trailing vapor. They'd crash land at their bases, written off as total losses. The remaining 4 completed their attacks, but the formation cohesion was broken, their aim disrupted by the unexpected barrage pattern. 0 hits on Allied ships, 7 Stukas, damaged or destroyed. The loss rate was 77%. That number circulated through the fleet within hours, passed along by signal lamp and radio transmission. 77% losses on a single attack run. That wasn't sustainable for any air unit, no matter how skilled or motivated. You couldn't maintain offensive capability when 3/4 of your aircraft didn't come back, and the day was just beginning. Over the next 6 hours, Stuka units flew 42 separate attack missions against the Sicily invasion fleet. The Luftwaffe committed everything they had, knowing this was their best chance to disrupt the landings. While ships were concentrated and vulnerable, every attack ran into the same deadly pattern. American gunners, now deliberately aiming above the diving aircraft, creating aerial kill zones that Stukas descended through on their attack runs. By nightfall on July 11th, 31 Stukas had been shot down or damaged beyond repair. An additional 17 sustained significant damage that grounded them for days or weeks pending repairs. The Luftwaffe had effectively lost half their Mediterranean dive bomber force in a single day. Allied shipping losses totaled 1 LST hit and beached, and damage to 2 destroyers from near misses. No ships sunk. The contrast with previous operations was staggering. During Operation Torch the previous November, Stuka attacks over a comparable time frame had sunk 3 transports and 2 destroyers while damaging 11 other vessels. The Germans had lost perhaps 8 aircraft total. The ratio had reversed completely. Instead of Stukas inflicting disproportionate damage while escaping mostly intact, they were being massacred while barely scratching the invasion fleet. German operational reports from those July days reveal an organization struggling to understand what had changed. Mission debriefs quote pilots describing anti-aircraft fire that seemed to anticipate their dive paths, creating walls of exploding shells at altitudes they hadn't reached yet. Several pilots reported the unsettling experience of diving through flak that felt like it was waiting for them, rather than chasing them. The description was uncannily accurate. That's exactly what American gunners were doing. They weren't trying to track the Stuka's current position. They were identifying the dive path and saturating a zone along that path at higher altitude. The Stuka's own momentum, its commitment to the near-vertical dive that made it such an accurate bomber, became its death sentence. Once in the dive, physics demanded the aircraft continue descending at predictable velocity. It couldn't suddenly reverse course or teleport sideways. It had to fly through that predetermined kill zone. Stuka Geschwader commanders recognized they were facing a tactical dead end. Continue attacking under current conditions, and they'd have no operational aircraft left within a week. Some units tried varying their approach, attempting dive angles that weren't quite vertical, hoping less predictable descent paths might help. The modifications didn't help significantly. The American gunners adjusted their aim points accordingly. Others tried diving from higher altitude, starting their attacks at 10,000 feet instead of 7 or 8, giving themselves more distance to work with. Higher dives just meant more time for defending gunners to fire more shells into the kill zone. A few desperate crews attempted low-altitude glide bombing instead of proper dives, coming in fast and flat to release their bombs. But Stukas at low altitude were sitting ducks for light anti-aircraft guns and small arms fire. The tactics that kept them alive, the near-vertical precision dive, had become the exact behavior that got them killed. By July 16th, 6 days into the Sicily campaign, the Luftwaffe had pulled most remaining Stuka units back to bases in northern Italy, out of range for attacks on the invasion beaches. The handful of units that continued operations suffered loss rates above 40% per mission. Those numbers weren't estimates or propaganda. They came from German unit records, aircraft status reports, showing serial numbers of planes that departed and never returned. The American tally for July 1943 was extraordinary. Against Stuka dive bombing attacks specifically, naval anti-aircraft batteries had shot down or damaged 93 confirmed enemy aircraft. That's 93 Stukas in 1 month. Additional kills went to Allied fighters, but the ship-based guns alone had effectively destroyed 2 full Geschwaders worth of aircraft. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The Bureau of Ordnance didn't wait for the campaign to conclude before moving forward. By July 20th, orders went out fleet-wide, formalizing what had started as Webb's unauthorized experiment. The official technical bulletin was designated Anti-Aircraft Doctrine Update 7-43, and it fundamentally rewrote how American gunners engaged diving targets. The new doctrine was called Altitude Lead Engagement. The terminology was carefully chosen to avoid the psychological barrier of telling gunners to aim behind the target. Instead, the doctrine framed it as leading the target vertically, rather than horizontally. You weren't aiming behind, you were aiming high. Semantics, perhaps, but important semantics because it helped gunners accept the technique without feeling like they were violating basic marksmanship principles. The technical implementation required modifications to fire control computers on ships equipped with Mark 14 systems. Engineers added mechanical cams that adjusted the altitude solution based on target dive angle and range. When a target was identified as diving toward the ship, the computer would automatically calculate the proper altitude offset and adjust aim accordingly. The gunner still tracked the target, but the system now pointed the guns several hundred feet higher than the aircraft's current position. For older ships without computing sights, the doctrine provided lookup tables. If target at 4,000 feet in steep dive, aim at 5,200 feet. If target at 3,000 feet, aim at 4,000 feet. The tables included corrections for different dive angles, different target speeds, different gun muzzle velocities. Gunners memorized them during drills the way previous generations had memorized wind deflection tables for naval rifles. Training protocols were revised across the entire pipeline. New recruits at Great Lakes Naval Training Station and the Gunnery School at Dam Neck, Virginia, started learning altitude lead engagement before they ever fired at crossing targets. The doctrine was taught as fundamental, not as an edge case or special situation. Any diving target required vertical lead. That was as basic as trigger discipline or sight picture. The psychological shift required was substantial but manageable, because the technique delivered visible results. Unlike the earlier revolution in deflection shooting against crossing targets, where gunners had to trust that aiming at empty sky would eventually work, altitude-led engagement provided immediate feedback. When you aimed high and the Stuka descended into your barrage, you could see that you'd predicted correctly. The aircraft flew into the explosions. The visual confirmation reinforced the technique, building confidence through success. By August 1943, altitude lead engagement was standard across the United States Navy and rapidly spreading to Army anti-aircraft units protecting ground installations. The British Royal Navy, which had been struggling with similar problems against Stuka attacks in the Mediterranean, adopted the American doctrine wholesale after reviewing the July combat data. Commonwealth forces began implementing it by September. The impact on Luftwaffe dive bomber operations was terminal. The Stuka had already been declining as a weapon system, rendered obsolete by improved Allied fighter coverage and increasingly lethal anti-aircraft defenses. But altitude lead engagement removed the last tactical niche where the Ju-87 remained effective. Even when Stukas found targets without fighter cover, the shipboard guns could now kill them at rates that made missions suicidal. German production of the Ju-87 continued through late 1944, but the aircraft were increasingly relegated to the Eastern Front, where they operated primarily against ground targets in sectors with limited anti-aircraft capability. Against Soviet forces who hadn't yet implemented sophisticated vertical lead techniques, the Stuka could still function. Against American or British naval units, attempting a dive-bombing attack was little different from suicide. The broader lesson extended well beyond anti-Stuka tactics. American fire control doctrine began emphasizing the importance of understanding target motion in 3 dimensions, not just 2. The assumption that deflection meant horizontal lead was abandoned. Any moving target required proper calculation of where it would be during projectile time of flight, regardless of whether that movement was horizontal, vertical, or some combination. This 3-dimensional thinking influenced the design of next-generation fire control systems. The Mark 37 Director, introduced in 1944, incorporated vertical motion tracking as a standard feature, not an add-on. The computer could solve for targets moving in any direction, at any angle, climbing or diving, or corkscrewing through evasive maneuvers. The Mark 14's limitation, its assumption of primarily horizontal movement, was designed out of its successor. Post-war analysis of the Sicily campaign conducted by the Naval War College identified altitude lead engagement as one of the 3 most significant tactical innovations of the Mediterranean theatre, alongside the development of proximity-fused shells and improved radar-directed fire control. The innovation hadn't required new technology. The guns were the same. The ammunition was the same. What changed was understanding, a recognition that human intuition about where to aim was systematically wrong when targets moved toward you vertically. The same principle that had trapped gunners at Dunkirk, the instinct to aim directly at visible threats, had trapped American gunners in the Mediterranean until Webb's analysis broke through the assumption. Once broken, once the correct physics were understood and translated into practical doctrine, the problem was solved. Not partially, comprehensively. The Stuka went from viable threat to obsolete liability within 30 days. Lieutenant Commander Marcus Webb received a commendation for his analysis. though the full story of his contribution didn't become public until post-war histories were written. He'd later joke that his greatest achievement in the war was convincing gunners that the correct response to a diving aircraft was to shoot at the sky above it. The joke captured something profound about human cognition and warfare. We're pattern-matching machines, optimized by evolution to respond to threats at speeds and scales our ancestors encountered. A charging predator, a thrown spear, dangers that moved horizontally across landscapes at velocities measurable in dozens of miles per hour. Aircraft diving at 300 miles per hour toward ships defended by projectile weapons with multi-second flight times existed in a regime evolution never prepared us for. Intuition failed. Instinct produced systematic errors. The only solution was to recognize that intuition was wrong and consciously override it with calculated alternatives based on mathematics rather than feeling. That's harder than it sounds. Your brain screams at you that aiming above a diving aircraft makes no sense. The threat is there, right there in your sight picture, and you're pointing your gun at empty air 300 feet above it. Every fiber of your being wants to correct that aim, drag it down to the visible target. Successful gunners learned to suppress that urge. They trusted the doctrine, trusted the calculations, aimed high, and fired. And Stukas fell from the sky in numbers that would have seemed impossible 6 months earlier. The transformation from 2% hit rates to sustained rates above 20% represented an order of magnitude improvement achieved through cognitive adjustment rather than technological advancement. The crews who survived those July engagements off Sicily carried the knowledge forward through the rest of the war. They became instructors, training replacements on altitude lead technique. They refined the doctrine through additional combat experience, adding nuances about adjusting for wind, for varying dive angles, for targets that rolled during their descent. The core principle remained unchanged. Fire where the target will be, accounting for all 3 dimensions of movement, not just the 2 your eyes naturally track. Modern anti-aircraft systems from the Vietnam era forward inherited this 3-dimensional tracking requirement as foundational. Surface-to-air missiles like the Nike Ajax and later the Patriot system had to solve the same problem, predicting where a target would be in 3-dimensional space and guiding interceptors to that position. The difference was that by the 1960s, computers could process those calculations in milliseconds rather than requiring gunners to reference lookup tables. But the underlying physics hadn't changed. Neither had the fundamental challenge of human cognition. Put a person behind a weapon without computing assistance and ask them to shoot at a fast-moving target, and they'll make the same errors World War II gunners made. They'll aim directly at what they see. They'll be systematically wrong. Training, doctrine, and experience can partially overcome that instinct, but the most reliable solution remains offloading the problem to machines that don't have intuitions to override. The Stuka's fate illustrated a broader truth about warfare and adaptation. Technologies and tactics exist within specific windows of vulnerability and effectiveness. The Ju-87 had been devastating in Poland and France because Allied defences couldn't effectively counter dive-bombing attacks. Not because the physics were different, but because the defenders didn't understand how to apply the physics correctly. Once that understanding developed and disseminated, the window closed. The same aircraft, the same tactic, suddenly became a liability rather than an asset. The Luftwaffe couldn't adapt fast enough. By the time they recognized that dive bombing against modern Allied fleets was suicidal, they'd already lost most of their experienced Stuka crews and hundreds of aircraft. Retraining on different platforms took months they didn't have. The industrial capacity to replace losses at sustainable rates no longer existed. Germany was fighting a losing war of attrition on multiple fronts by mid-1943, and losing entire dive bomber wings to revolutionary defensive doctrine was one more compounding factor in their eventual collapse. For the Allies, particularly for American forces that would spend the next 2 years conducting amphibious operations across the Pacific, mastery of altitude lead engagement meant their invasion fleets could operate with significantly less risk from dive-bombing attacks. Japanese Val and Judy dive bombers would face the same deadly reception that Stukas encountered off Sicily. The doctrine worked regardless of who built the attacking aircraft, because physics was universal. The 93 Stukas shot down in July 1943 represented more than statistical tallies in after-action reports. Each aircraft carried a crew, usually 2 men, pilot and rear gunner. Most didn't survive their aircraft's destruction. Some ejected or bailed out over water and were picked up by Allied vessels, becoming prisoners. A handful made it back to German-held territory. But the majority died, because when your aircraft is hit at 3,000 feet during a near-vertical dive, there's rarely time to escape. The human cost for the Luftwaffe was severe, but from the Allied perspective, every Stuka shot down was one less bomb hitting their ships, one less destroyer. Damaged, one less LST sunk with troops aboard. The cold calculus of war meant that American gunners celebrated when the vertical lead technique worked, when they saw that Stuka's wing fold, when it cartwheeled into the Mediterranean trailing smoke. Those were victories, clear and unambiguous. The doctrine's influence didn't end when the last Stuka was pulled from frontline service. Altitude lead engagement became the foundation for how militaries worldwide approached the problem of fast-moving aerial targets for the next 3 decades, until guided missiles largely replaced guns as the primary anti-aircraft weapon. But even in the missile age, the core insight remained critical. You must predict where the target will be, not where it is. The Korean War provided the next major test case. When North Korean forces invaded southward in June 1950, their air force included a mix of Soviet-supplied aircraft, some of which employed dive-bombing tactics against United Nations ground forces and naval vessels. American anti-aircraft crews, many of them World War II veterans or trained by veterans, implemented altitude lead engagement automatically. The doctrine was so thoroughly integrated into training by 1950 that it wasn't even discussed as a special technique anymore. It was just how you shot at diving aircraft. North Korean and Chinese pilots learned the same brutal lesson their German predecessors had discovered over Sicily. Committing to a predictable dive path against defenders who understood vertical lead was suicide. Loss rates for communist dive-bombing attacks against protected targets exceeded 30% throughout the war. Those numbers forced tactical adaptation. By 1951, most enemy air-to-ground attacks shifted to level bombing from higher altitude or low-level strafing runs that avoided the extended vertical exposure of classical dive bombing. The shift represented a complete inversion of tactical wisdom from just a decade earlier. In 1940, dive bombing had been considered the most accurate method for hitting point targets. By 1951, it was considered the most dangerous for the attacker. What changed wasn't the physics of gravity or ballistics. What changed was that defenders finally understood how to exploit the predictability that dive bombing required. Vietnam brought a different challenge. American forces faced surface-to-air missiles and radar-directed anti-aircraft artillery that could engage targets at ranges and altitudes impossible for World War II systems. But the fundamental principle of altitude lead engagement remained embedded in how those systems operated. The Soviet-designed SA-2 guideline missiles that caused so many losses for American aircraft worked by calculating the target's future position based on current trajectory and velocity, then guiding the missile to intercept that predicted point. It was altitude lead engagement implemented with rocket motors instead of gun barrels. The mathematics were more complex, accounting for the missile's own flight characteristics and maneuvering capability. But the core concept was identical. Shoot where the target will be, not where it is. American Wild Weasel crews, tasked with suppressing enemy air defenses, studied SA-2 engagement parameters, the way Stuka pilots had once studied Allied anti-aircraft doctrine. They learned that unpredictable maneuvering, constant changes in altitude and heading, degraded the missile's ability to predict their future position. The best defense against prediction-based weapons was to be unpredictable, which meant never flying straight and level any longer than absolutely necessary, never maintaining constant altitude, never giving the enemy's computers a clean track to calculate from. It was exhausting, dangerous flying that pushed aircraft to their structural limits. but it worked because it attacked the foundation of the engagement doctrine. If the defender couldn't reliably predict where you'd be in 3 seconds, they couldn't hit you with prediction-based weapons. Modern air combat has evolved far beyond the scenarios that prompted altitude lead engagements development. Fighters engage at ranges measured in tens of miles, using radar-guided missiles that can adjust their trajectory continuously based on updated target information. The AIM-120 AMRAAM doesn't just predict where the target will be at one future moment. It recalculates that prediction hundreds of times per second throughout its flight, adjusting course to match whatever the target does. The missile essentially performs continuous altitude lead engagement, constantly updating its solution as new data arrives. Against such weapons, even aggressive maneuvering provides limited protection. The engagement has moved from a geometry problem to an energy problem. Can your aircraft turn hard enough, often enough, to exhaust the missile's maneuvering fuel before it reaches you? Sometimes yes, often no. But the principle that drove Webb's breakthrough in 1943 remains foundational. Every weapons system that engages moving targets must solve the prediction problem. Modern point defense systems like the Phalanx CIWS, protecting naval vessels from anti-ship missiles, track incoming targets with radar, calculate predicted intercept points, and fire 20mm tungsten penetrators into those predicted positions at rates of 4,500 rounds per minute. The Phalanx doesn't aim at where the radar shows the missile right now. It aims at where its computer predicts the missile will be in the fraction of a second it takes for bullets to reach that point in space. The engagement happens so fast, missile detection to splash in under 2 seconds, that human decision-making is completely removed. The system operates autonomously because human reaction times are too slow, yet the mathematics solving the problem are direct descendants of the equations Webb worked through on his legal pad aboard Philadelphia. Projectile velocity, target velocity, time of flight, predicted intercept point. The computers are incomparably faster, the sensors incomparably more precise, but the underlying physics problem is identical to what American gunners faced against diving Stukas. The human element hasn't disappeared entirely, even in highly automated systems. Fighter pilots still train in basic fighter maneuvers that include guns-only engagements, not because they expect to dogfight with cannon fire in actual combat, but because learning to visually predict target motion builds spatial awareness that applies to every aspect of air combat. A pilot who's internalized how to lead a maneuvering target with gunsight understands intuitively how to position for a missile shot, how to judge closure rates, how to anticipate an enemy's next move. The training perpetuates lessons first learned in desperation over the Mediterranean in 19-part compasses. 43. Trust prediction over intuition. Aim where the target will be, not where your eyes see it now. Accept that the correct solution often looks wrong initially. These cognitive principles transfer across decades and technological generations because human neurology hasn't changed. We're still pattern-matching machines poorly optimized for the speeds and scales of modern combat. The Stuka itself became a footnote to aviation history, remembered primarily as a symbol of Blitzkrieg's early successes rather than for its technical characteristics or tactical utility. Most people who recognize the Ju-87's distinctive silhouette associate it with the terror of dive bombing, with the psychological impact of that screaming siren, with the image of German air superiority in the war's opening years. Fewer remember that by 1943, the Stuka had become a liability, an obsolete aircraft type that could only survive in increasingly restricted tactical situations. The 93 shot down in July 1943 represented roughly 12% of total Ju-87 production losses during the entire war. 1 month, 12% of all Stukas ever destroyed. The concentration of losses wasn't coincidental. It marked the moment when Allied defensive capabilities finally caught up with and surpassed the threat. The Luftwaffe produced approximately 6,000 Stukas total between 1936 and 1944. By war's end, fewer than 100 remained operational, and those were relegated to night harassment missions and training duties. The attrition came from multiple causes: fighter attacks, ground fire, operational accidents, but the fundamental reason the Stuka disappeared from frontline service was that it had lost its tactical niche. The aircraft had been designed for a specific operational concept: precise delivery of bombs onto point targets in environments where the Luftwaffe controlled the air. That environment existed in Poland, in France, in the Balkans, in the early years of the Russian campaign. It ceased to exist once the Allies achieved air superiority and developed effective counter-tactics. The Stuka couldn't adapt because its core design, the fixed landing gear that created drag, the lack of speed and maneuverability, the vulnerability to fighter attack, were intrinsic to the airframe. You couldn't retrofit a Stuka into something it wasn't. German engineers tried producing improved variants with more powerful engines, better armor, upgraded weapons. None of it addressed the fundamental problem that the aircraft's tactical employment made it predictable, and predictable targets died when faced with defenders who understood prediction-based engagement. The broader lesson resonated through subsequent decades of military development. Predictability in warfare is death. Any tactic, any technology, any operational pattern that allows an enemy to reliably anticipate your actions gives that enemy a targeting solution. The Stuka's dive path was predictable because physics demanded it. Once committed to the dive, the aircraft had to descend at velocities determined by gravity, aerodynamics, and structural limits. American gunners exploited that predictability ruthlessly once they understood how to calculate the intercept. Modern combat emphasizes unpredictability as survival doctrine. Stealth technology makes aircraft difficult to detect, which is a form of unpredictability. You can't predict where something will be if you don't know where it is now. Electronic warfare creates false targets and spoofs tracking systems, injecting uncertainty into an enemy's prediction calculations. Maneuver warfare doctrine emphasizes tempo and deception specifically to prevent enemies from establishing reliable patterns they can exploit. All of these concepts trace lineage back to harder lessons. The Stuka crews who died off Sicily demonstrated what happens when your tactics become predictable. The American gunners who killed them demonstrated what happens when you correctly understand and exploit that predictability. War is ultimately about information, about knowing what will happen before it does, about turning uncertainty in your favor and imposing it on your enemy. Altitude lead engagement was an information victory disguised as a gunnery technique. It represented American forces learning to correctly interpret the information their sensors provided, the visual tracking of a diving aircraft, and transform that information into accurate predictions of future positions. That transformation from observation to prediction to action closed the loop that had been broken throughout the Mediterranean campaign's early months. The statistical improvement from 2% hit rates to 20% hit rates represented orders of magnitude increase in defensive effectiveness achieved through pure cognitive adjustment. The guns didn't change. The ships didn't change. What changed was understanding, and that understanding multiplied combat power by factors that new weapons development rarely achieved. There's something profound in that outcome about the nature of warfare and human problem-solving. Sometimes the answer to a tactical crisis isn't more firepower or better technology. Sometimes the answer is thinking differently about the problem you face, questioning assumptions that seem obviously true, testing hypotheses that seem obviously wrong. Webb's insight that gunners should aim above diving aircraft violated every intuition about marksmanship. It seemed crazy until you worked through the mathematics and realized it was correct. How many other tactical problems throughout history remained unsolved, not because solutions were impossible, but because the correct solution seemed too counterintuitive to seriously consider? How many defeats resulted from commanders trusting their intuitions over physics, over mathematics, over careful analysis that suggested uncomfortable answers? The story of altitude lead engagement is ultimately about intellectual courage as much as physical courage. The courage to look at catastrophic failure, to analyze it objectively, to propose solutions that sound insane, and to implement those solutions even when every instinct screams they're wrong. Webb had that courage. The gunnery officers who trusted his analysis enough to test it had that courage. The gun crews who aimed at empty sky above diving aircraft, despite every fibre of their being wanting to aim at the visible threat, had that courage. And 93 Stukas fell from the Mediterranean sky in July 1943 because courage met mathematics, met desperate necessity. The combination proved lethal, not to the defenders who embraced it, but to the attackers who faced it without understanding how completely the tactical equation had shifted against them. War's mathematics are unforgiving. Understanding them beats not understanding them every single time. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.